epidemics are an anxious time for everybody, not least this bloke, Henry VIII. He looks extremely fearless in his official portraits, striding around in his codpiece and his tights and lopping off heads to the left and to the right. But, in fact, Henry suffered from extreme health anxiety. That's about his own health, not anyone else's, obviously. And he had built for himself what were essentially little self-isolation rooms. And these were off his official royal bedchambers, which were spacious and luxurious, and they were essentially little cells where he could lock himself away if there were any signs of disease at court. They contained his favourite musical instruments, his favourite books, and his servants would pass his food through a hatch in the door. Pretty big hatch, can only assume, because he liked his food. He was particularly terrified of a mysterious and admittedly scary disease, then called the sweating sickness or the English sweat, because that's where all the epidemics between the 1480s and 1550s began. The sweat did not play by the rules. Most diseases kill poor people in far greater numbers because poor people are vulnerable in a number of ways because of their diet, access to medical care, and because, of course, they have to go to work. And that's all right. Monarchs can take that, we can take a few losses for the herd, but it's not all right when they start killing the rich. The workers called the sweating sickness stop gallant because it killed the gallants, the rich men in particular, and particularly rich men who were tall, middle-aged and pale-skinned. And oh dear, that was Henry to a T. People wondered if it was a sign of divine judgment from God. One Italian church official, who was in England during an outbreak, said it represented the harshness of the monarch towards his people, by which almost all are heavily oppressed, and under which they sweated, that is to say, were forced to undergo many discomforts. That king was Henry VII, the dad of our Henry VIII. He'd seized the throne for the Tudors from Richard III after the Battle of Bosworth Field, and many people were unhappy about this, not least Richard, who of course got bumped off at Bosworth, poor bloke. So what this church official was saying was that the poor are so badly treated under the Tudors that the sweating sickness has been sent by God to punish the rich. Nice theory, very fond of that theory. But unfortunately it doesn't really track, not least because we know it was around before the Battle of Bosworth, because this bloke, Lord Stanley, used it as an excuse to basically pull a sickie. He supported Richard III, but he wanted to switch sides to Henry. So he basically sent Richard a sort of apology note saying, love to attend your battle, looks amazing, but got to take a rain check because the lads are down with the old sweat. And then he showed up supporting the other side, who luckily for him won. Henry VII wasn't just the dad of Big Henry or Henry VIII. His elder son was Prince Arthur. Prince Arthur died in 1502, aged only 15, and he may have died of the sweating sickness. His wife survived it and survived him. His wife was Catherine of Aragon. If that name's familiar, it's because Henry VIII, of course, marries her 7 years later. He inherits his brother's wife. The sweating sickness actually started with chills. People felt cold before they felt so suffocatingly hot they would throw off their bed covers. And people who were previously apparently very healthy could die very quickly between dinner and breakfast, it was said. You could survive recurrent bouts of it. Thomas Cromwell did, but his wife and daughters died overnight. When the sweat arrived at court in 1528, Henry VIII was off. He legged it, or rather his horse did. He travelled endlessly from place to place, from castle to castle. He had at least 67 royal houses and properties, so he wasn't having to Airbnb it. With him came his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and they moved constantly trying to stay ahead of this disease. But Henry was gearing up for wife too. He was in love with Anne Boleyn, and he'd sent her away to quarantine herself at her beautiful family home, Hever Castle. To his horror, he heard that Anne had become ill, and he sent her passionate love letters, saying that if it would only make her well, he would happily bear half her sickness. You've got to notice that half, haven't you? Like, I love you, girl, but let's not get carried away. He also sent her his second best doctor, because his first was with him, obviously, Dr. Butts. Now, not a proctologist. Now, I can see what you're thinking. Anne and Henry survived the sweat. She returned to court, and after a very messy divorce, he, of course, married her. But it wasn't happily ever after. After only 8 years, after she became ill, she failed to produce a male heir, and she lost her head, poor woman. Indirectly, you could say the sweating sickness killed her, because if Arthur hadn't died and Henry hadn't have become king, her head would probably have stayed on its shoulders. The sweating sickness vanished after a last bout in 1551. It just went as mysteriously as it had come, and we still don't know the cause. It could have been a hantavirus, that looks possible, which is spread by rodents. Dr. Paul Heyman, one of the experts who's worked on studying the sweating sickness, leaves us with this not very reassuring thought. Whether or not the English sweat will return, who can say? Let's hope it doesn't, and we don't have to take to our heels like a royal.